The wind that swept down from the Wind River foothills that autumn carried something colder than the season itself. It carried the disapproval of every man in the settlement of Bramble Hollow. Thomas Ainsworth stood on the low rise he had chosen for his cabin, one hand resting on the shoulder of a broad-chested hound named Shepherd, and he listened. His face was turned into the wind. His eyes, ruined by a shell burst at Antietam 13 years earlier, saw nothing at all. Yet the men gathered around him could tell from the way he held himself that he was reading the ground more carefully than any of them had ever read it. Two brothers stood a few paces off, arms folded, breath frosting in the pale morning light. Kenneth Marrow was the older of the two, tall and lean, with a face weathered by 20 winters of building barns and raising rafters. Larry Marrow was shorter, thicker through the shoulders, quieter by nature. Between them they had helped raise nearly every cabin in the settlement. They had come that morning as neighbors, not as strangers, and they had brought their tools. "Thomas," Kenneth said, keeping his voice level, "you've got the door and the window facing straight north." "I do," Thomas answered. "Every wind that matters in this country comes down out of the north. Come January, you'll be sleeping with a snowdrift in your bed and a fire that won't hold." Thomas did not turn his head. He listened instead to the way Kenneth's voice bent around the small rise, the way it seemed to hesitate before it reached him. That hesitation told him something about the shape of the land that the sighted brothers had not yet noticed. He said nothing about it. Larry stepped closer. "We'll turn it for you. No charge. Half a day's work between the two of us. You face the door south, put the window on the east wall, and you'll thank us come February." The offer was fair. It was more than fair. Thomas understood that. He had lived in the settlement long enough to know that Kenneth and Larry Marrow did not offer their labor lightly, and he knew what refusal would cost him in the eyes of every man watching. Still, he shook his head once slowly. "The cabin faces north," he said. "The door, the window, the way I've laid the foundation stones." Kenneth exchanged a glance with his brother that Thomas could not see but could nearly feel. It was the look of two practical men trying to decide how hard to press a stubborn one. Behind them, 3 or 4 other settlers had drifted up the rise, drawn by the sound of the conversation. Word had already spread through Bramble Hollow that the blind man was building his cabin backwards. Now it was being confirmed in front of witnesses. "Thomas," Kenneth said, softer this time, "you don't have to be proud about this. There isn't a builder in the territory who'd tell you different." "I'm not being proud," Thomas said. He did not explain further. He simply reached down, ran his fingers along the notched top log of what would become his south wall, and traced the joint where the corner would rise. Shepherd shifted beside him, panting quietly. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk called once and was gone. Kenneth waited. He waited longer than most men would have. When it became clear no explanation was coming, he nodded once, gathered his tools, and started back down the rise with his brother following behind. The Marrow brothers did not speak until they were halfway down the slope. Larry was the first to break the silence, his voice low so it would not carry back up to the rise. "He's going to freeze." "He might. You saw the way he had those stones laid. That door's going to catch every north wind between here and Canada." Kenneth did not answer right away. He was a man who liked to turn a problem over in his hands before he set it down. He had watched Thomas trace the notch on that top log with fingers that moved like a carpenter's, not a wanderer's, and something about it had unsettled him. A blind man ought to fumble. Thomas had not fumbled. His hand had gone exactly where it meant to go. "He's been out here alone almost 3 years," Kenneth said at last. "Living in that lean-to on the creek. Trapping his own meat, cutting his own wood. That dog of his hasn't lost a pound. Whatever he's doing, he isn't dying. That's the lean-to. This is a cabin. A cabin's different. I know it is." They walked the rest of the way to the wagon in silence. Behind them on the rise, Thomas remained where they had left him, his hand still resting on the notched log. He waited until the crunch of the brothers' boots faded into the distance before he moved. Then he turned his face slowly through a full half-circle, letting the wind touch each side of his cheek in turn, cataloging the small differences in temperature and pressure that told him where he was standing in relation to the world. Shepherd nudged his knee. Thomas dropped his hand and let his fingers work through the thick fur behind the dog's ears. "They mean well," he said. Shepard's tail thumped once against his leg. Thomas began to walk the outline of what would become his cabin. He had paced this rectangle so many times over the past weeks that his boots knew the corners without any conscious effort from him. 12 paces along the south wall, 10 along the east, 12 back along the north, 10 to close the square. At each corner, a squared stone had been set the previous summer, waiting patiently under a covering of canvas for the framing to begin. What Kenneth and Larry had not seen, what none of the settlers who came to look had seen, was the second structure. It stood behind the cabin site, north of the foundation stones, and at first glance it looked like nothing more than a low mound of earth and brush. Thomas walked to it now. He climbed the packed dirt slope carefully, one hand out for balance, and stopped when the wind caught him full in the face. The berm was nearly finished. It had taken him the better part of 2 summers to build, hauling logs down from the timber line one at a time behind a borrowed ox, packing earth over them layer by layer, letting each course settle through a season of rain before adding the next. It stood almost 15 feet high at its center and stretched 30 feet along its base. It curved slightly, like the back of a sleeping animal, its highest point set exactly where the wind now struck Thomas's face hardest. He stood on top of it and listened. Somewhere below, a magpie chattered. The wind pulled at his coat. He turned his face into it and smiled just faintly. The berm was in the right place. He had known it would be. The story of how Thomas Ainsworth came to know exactly where the north wind struck his rise began 3 years earlier, on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1872, when a trapper named Silas Boone rode down out of the mountains with a string of beaver pelts and a broken saddle horn. Thomas had been living in the Linta by the creek for less than 4 months at that point. He had come west after the war on a small government pension, drifting from one settlement to the next, unwilling to accept the charity of relatives back in Ohio and unwilling to sit in a boarding house waiting to die. He had chosen Bramble Hollow almost at random, drawn by the sound of the water and the mildness of the summer air. The rise above the creek had been claimed by no one. He had put his lean-to on it and started learning the land by touch and by sound. Silas Boone had ridden in looking for a blacksmith to reset his saddle horn and had ended up sharing Thomas's fire for 3 nights running. He was a quiet man past 60, with the patience of somebody who had spent most of his life waiting for animals to make mistakes. On the second evening, Thomas made him an offer. "I want you to survey this rise for me," Thomas said. "Every wind direction, every storm track, every drift line when the snow comes. I want it recorded for a full year. I'll pay you fair wages and provide your keep." Silas had chewed on that for a long moment before answering. "You mean to build here?" "I mean to build here. And you can't see the land." "No, so I need somebody who can, somebody who won't guess." Silas had agreed on the 3rd morning. The terms were simple. He would return to the rise once a month, spend 3 days making observations, and record everything in a leather-bound journal that Thomas would keep. He would note the direction of every prevailing wind, the position of every snowdrift, the path of every storm cloud that passed overhead, and the tracks of every animal that crossed the property. He would do this for 12 full months, through every season, and at the end he would sit down with Thomas and read the entire journal aloud from cover to cover. Silas was not a fanciful man. He did not ask why. He simply took the money and did the work. Once a month, for a full year, he rode down out of the mountains and spent 3 days walking the rise with a compass, a thermometer, and a small brass instrument that measured wind speed. He wrote in the journal by lantern light in the lean-to, and when the year was finished, he read it aloud to Thomas over the course of 4 evenings. What the journal revealed was something no one in Bramble Hollow had ever bothered to measure. The prevailing winds in the valley did come from the north for most of the year. That much was common knowledge. But the strongest storms, the ones that cracked ridgepoles and stripped shingles, did not always follow the prevailing pattern. Roughly 1 storm in every 4 came in from the south, driven by rotating pressure systems that spun down out of the Rockies and hit the valley from behind. And on Thomas's particular rise, the true north wind, the deep winter wind that carried the killing cold, funneled through a gap in the ridge line and struck the ground at a very specific point. Thomas had marked that point in his memory. That was where the berm would go. The framing of the cabin began the week after the Merrill brothers made their offer. Thomas worked alone, or nearly alone. Shepard kept him company, and a hired man named Wesley Hobb came up from the settlement 3 days a week to handle the tasks that required 2 pairs of hands and a pair of working eyes. Wesley was young, barely 20, and he had grown up on a farm outside Cheyenne where his father had taught him carpentry before dying of a fever. He asked few questions and did what he was told. Thomas paid him in silver coin at the end of each week. The logs had been cut and cured the previous summer. They lay stacked along the south edge of the property, each one marked by Thomas with a small notch that indicated its position in the wall. He had memorized the sequence by running his hands over the notches for weeks before the felling. Wesley would call out a number, Thomas would name the log, and together they would drag it into place with a chain and a pulley. The work went faster than the men in Bramble Hollow expected. By the end of the second week, the walls stood chest-high. By the end of the fourth, the ridgepole was in place and Wesley was nailing down the roof boards. Thomas worked the joints himself, feeling each notch with his fingers, checking every corner with a plumb line that Wesley held steady while Thomas ran his hand down the string. Kenneth Marrow rode past the rise once during the third week. He did not stop. He only slowed his horse enough to see that the door frame was set into the north wall exactly as Thomas had said it would be, and that the single window opening had been cut directly beside it. He shook his head once and rode on. That evening he sat at his own supper table and told his wife what he had seen. Her name was Ruth, and she was a practical woman who did not waste words on foolishness. "The blind man knows he's blind," she said. "He isn't a child. He isn't. But he doesn't know wind the way we do. Maybe he knows it differently." Kenneth chewed slowly on that for a while and did not answer. Larry, who had come over for supper with his own wife Nancy, looked up from his plate. "Nancy and I walked past there this afternoon," Larry said. "She noticed something." Nancy Marrow was a small woman with quick eyes and a quiet voice. She set down her fork before she spoke. "There's a mound behind the cabin, big one. Higher than the roof near enough. A mound, log and earth, curved, set to the north of the building." Kenneth frowned. "I didn't see any mound. You wouldn't have from the road. It's tucked in behind the rise, but it's there and it's been there a while. The grass on it is settled. That wasn't built this summer." Kenneth set down his knife. He looked from his brother to Nancy and then back to his wife. Ruth met his eyes evenly. "Maybe," she said, "the blind man knows something you don't." Kenneth did not answer that either. But the next morning he saddled his horse before dawn and rode back up to the rise. He did not approach the cabin. He circled the property at a distance, staying just inside the tree line, and studied the mound Nancy had described. From that angle it was clearly visible, and clearly deliberate, and clearly finished long before the cabin's foundation had ever been laid. He rode home thoughtful. Winter came to the Wind River foothills in the last week of October that year. It came slowly at first, in a series of soft snows that dusted the ridgelines and melted by afternoon, and then all at once, in a hard freeze that arrived overnight and locked the creek in ice by morning. The men of Bramble Hollow finished their winter preparations in a hurry. Wood was stacked against every south wall. Root cellars were sealed. Livestock was moved into barns and sheds and the smaller outbuildings that would keep the wind off them through the long months ahead. Thomas finished his own preparations without help. The cabin was tight. Wesley had done good work on the roof, and Thomas himself had chinked every seam between the logs with a mixture of clay and dried moss that he had prepared the previous summer. The single door on the north wall was heavy, oak-planked, and hung on iron hinges that Thomas had bought from a smith in Lander. The single window beside it was small, no wider than his forearm, and fitted with a shutter that could be barred from the inside. When both were closed, the cabin was as tight as any dwelling in the settlement. Behind the cabin, the berm stood silent and unnoticed by anyone who did not know to look for it. Snow settled into its curves and hardened there. By the middle of November, it had become part of the landscape. indistinguishable from the low ridges around it to any eye that had not watched it built. The first real storm of the season came in mid-December. It came from the north, exactly as every builder in the settlement had predicted the storms would come. Wind hammered down out of the ridgeline and struck the valley for 2 full days. In Bramble Hollow, doors rattled and stovepipes shook, and one family lost part of a barn roof to a gust that came sideways through a gap in the trees. But the settlement's cabins held. They had been built for this wind, oriented against it, and they had done their work. Thomas's cabin also held. Behind it, the berm split the wind cleanly. Thomas heard the sound of the split from inside, the way a river sounds when it parts around a stone, and he sat by his fire and listened to it with quiet satisfaction. Shepherd lay at his feet. The cabin was warm. The door on the north wall did not so much as rattle in its frame. By Christmas, the settlement had begun to relax. The first storm had come and gone without disaster, and the pattern of winter seemed to be holding to its usual shape. Kenneth Marrow rode up to the rise one afternoon during the week between Christmas and New Year, ostensibly to bring Thomas a jar of Ruth's preserves. In truth, he wanted to see the cabin from close up. Thomas met him at the door with Shepherd at his heel. He did not seem surprised. He accepted the preserves with a nod and invited Kenneth in for coffee, and Kenneth sat by the fire for the better part of an hour, looking around the small room with careful eyes. The cabin was neat. A rope had been strung from the door to the stove, and another from the stove to the bed, and a third from the bed to the woodpile. Thomas moved along these ropes without hesitation. Everything he needed was within reach of a hand that knew where to look for it. Kenneth left without asking about the berm. He was not yet ready to admit that he wanted to know. January passed quietly. 2 more northerly storms swept through the valley, and both were weathered without significant damage. The settlement began to speak of it as a mild winter, which is the kind of thing settlers always say when they have just enough evidence to be dangerously wrong. Larry Marrow told his wife over breakfast one morning that if the season held to its current pace, they would be putting seed in the ground by the first week of April. Nancy, who was quieter and more inclined to watch the sky than her husband, did not answer. She had noticed that the birds were behaving strangely. The magpies had gone silent, and the ravens were flying low. February brought a thaw. It was brief and unseasonable. 3 days of soft air and dripping eaves that fooled several families into believing the worst of the winter was behind them. Children came out to play in the muddy yards. A rancher on the eastern edge of the settlement moved half his cattle out of the wintering barn to graze on the exposed grass. Nancy Marrow watched all of this from her kitchen window and pressed her lips into a thin line. "Something's coming," she told Larry that night. "Nothing's coming. The birds are just late this year. Something's coming." Larry did not argue with her. He had learned over 8 years of marriage that Nancy's instincts about weather were rarely wrong, and even when he could not follow her reasoning, he had learned to prepare for the possibility that she was right. He spent the following morning bringing in extra firewood and checking the shutters on every window of their cabin. The cabin faced south, as every sensible cabin in Bramble Hollow did, with its door and its 2 windows opening toward the winter sun, and its back set against the direction the north wind came from. The storm arrived on the 4th of March. It arrived from the wrong direction. Nobody in the settlement understood at first what was happening. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, and it picked up hard, but it came from the south. That in itself was not unheard of. Southerly winds pass through the valley 3 or 4 times a season, usually bringing mild air ahead of a change in weather. But this wind did not bring mild air. It brought a sudden and terrible cold, and behind the cold came snow, driving nearly horizontal, and behind the snow came a howling gale that within an hour was strong enough to pull loose shingles off the roofs it struck. Kenneth Marrow was in his barn when the wind shifted. He felt the change in his skin before he understood it in his mind. He stepped to the barn door and looked out across the yard toward his cabin, and he saw immediately that something was wrong. The wind was hitting his cabin broadside. The whole south wall, the wall that held the door and both windows, was taking the full force of the storm directly against its face. The shutters were rattling in a way he had never heard them rattle. As he watched, one of them tore loose and spun away across the yard. He ran for the house. Ruth met him at the door with a look he had rarely seen on her face. She was afraid, and Ruth was not a woman who frightened easily. "The chimney's smoking wrong," she said. "The wind is pushing the smoke back down." Kenneth pushed past her and looked at the fireplace. She was right. The draft had reversed. The south wind was pouring straight into the chimney and driving the smoke back into the room. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed the valley whole. Snow drove sideways through the settlement, piling in strange places, tearing loose in others. The temperature dropped so fast that a bucket of water left on a porch step froze solid within 20 minutes. Kenneth barred every shutter on the south side of his cabin, but the wind found its way in through gaps he had never known existed. Cold air pushed through the door frame. Snow sifted through the seam where the roof met the wall. The fire in the hearth guttered again and again as the reversed draft fought the flames. Larry Merrow's cabin, half a mile to the west, was in worse shape. His south wall had taken a gust just before dark that had torn the shutter off his largest window and cracked the pane behind it. Larry had stuffed the opening with blankets and hammered a plank across the frame, but the wind kept working at it, and the blankets kept slipping. Nancy stood by the fire with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She had said almost nothing since the storm began. Her eyes moved constantly between the window and the door. Around midnight, the roof went. It went in a single sudden peal, starting at the northeast corner and tearing back across the ridge in a sound that Larry would remember for the rest of his life. The wind, striking the cabin from the south, had got underneath the eaves on the leeward side and lifted them like a hand lifting the cover off a dish. Snow poured into the loft immediately. Cold poured in behind it. Nancy screamed once, and then she was on her feet and moving toward the ladder. "Leave it," Larry shouted. "Leave everything. We have to get out." Where? He did not know where. Every cabin in the settlement was oriented the same way his was. Every one of them was taking the wind broadside. He thought of Kenneth's place half a mile east, and he thought of the church, which was smaller than his own cabin and no better sheltered. He thought finally of Thomas. The blind man's cabin was a full mile north of theirs, up the rise above the creek. It was the last direction any sane person would have chosen to walk in a blizzard. But Larry had ridden past that cabin a dozen times over the winter, and he had seen, without ever quite acknowledging it, that the wind never seemed to touch it the way it touched the others. And he remembered now the mound Nancy had described the previous autumn. The mound on the north side. The mound that faced the direction the storms were supposed to come from. If Thomas had built for wind from the north, and this wind was coming from the south, then Thomas's cabin was taking the storm exactly where its builder had prepared for it. "We're going to Thomas's," Larry said. Nancy did not question him. She wrapped herself in every layer she could find and pulled on the heavy boots that stood by the door. Larry did the same. He tied a length of rope around his waist and knotted the other end around hers so they could not be separated by the wind. Then he opened the door. The cold that met them was beyond anything either of them had ever felt. It was not simply cold. It was a living thing, hungry, pulling at their skin and their breath. Nancy stumbled after 2 steps and went down on one knee. Larry lifted her back to her feet and pointed north into the darkness. The rope pulled taut between them. They started walking. They did not walk in a straight line. No one could have. The wind pushed them sideways with every step, and the snow was already deep enough in places to bury Nancy to the thigh. Larry broke trail ahead of her, and she followed in his boot prints, and the rope between them stretched and slackened and stretched again as the drifts forced them apart and pulled them together. They passed Kenneth's cabin at a distance of perhaps 200 yards. Larry could not see it through the storm, but he knew where it stood, and he angled toward it out of instinct. Halfway across the field, he nearly walked into his brother. Kenneth was moving in the same direction. He had his wife Ruth beside him, and their 2 children, a boy of 10 named Isaac and a girl of 7 named Martha, wrapped in blankets and clinging to their mother's coat. Kenneth had reached the same conclusion Larry had, only he had reached it earlier. His chimney had been smoking wrong for hours. His south wall was buckling. He had gathered his family and roped them together and started walking north the moment he understood that the wind was not going to shift. The two families joined without speaking. There was no breath to spare for words. Kenneth took the lead, and Larry brought up the rear, and Nancy walked in the middle beside Ruth and the children. They moved as a single line, roped together, leaning into the wind that came at them from behind and drove them forward faster than they could safely walk. A quarter-mile from the rise, Nancy went down and did not get up. Larry felt the rope go slack. He turned and saw her lying face down in the snow, and he did not remember afterward how he covered the distance between them. He only remembered lifting her. Her boots had filled with snow somewhere along the way, and her feet, when he touched them through the leather, felt like wood. She was still breathing. Her eyes were open, but she could not stand and she could not speak, and Larry understood with a cold certainty that her feet were freezing inside her boots. He lifted her into his arms and shouted to Kenneth. Kenneth turned, saw what had happened, and did not hesitate. He took Isaac by the hand and passed the boy to Ruth, and then he came back down the line and helped Larry adjust his grip on Nancy so that her weight was carried across his chest and shoulder rather than his arms alone. Larry was a strong man, but a mile in this wind, carrying a full-grown woman, would break stronger men than him. "Keep walking," Kenneth said. "Don't stop. I'll break the trail." They kept walking. Larry could not tell afterward how long it took. It might have been 30 minutes. It might have been an hour. His face went numb, and then his hands, and then he stopped feeling the cold at all, which was more frightening than the cold itself. Nancy did not speak. She lay against his shoulder with her cheek pressed to the collar of his coat, and every few steps he shifted her weight to make sure she was still breathing. The rise came up in front of them without warning. Kenneth, breaking trail, walked into the base of it before he understood he had arrived. He turned and shouted something that the wind tore away. Larry did not need to hear him. He knew this ground. Somewhere above them up the slope the cabin was standing. And then, impossibly, through the driving snow, he saw a light. The light was small. It came from the single window on the north wall, filtered through the shutter slats, and it should not have been visible at any distance in a storm like that one. But the wind, striking the berm at the top of the rise, was splitting cleanly around the cabin, and the pocket of still air on the south side of the building held the light steady. Larry saw it through a break in the driving snow and understood that they were going to live. Kenneth reached the door first. He pounded on it with a gloved fist, and the door opened almost before his hand had struck it a second time. Thomas stood in the doorway with Shepard at his knee. He did not ask who was there. He simply stepped back and held the door wide. "All of you," he said, "come in, close it behind you." They stumbled inside. Larry came last, still carrying Nancy, and he saw the room by the firelight as if he were seeing it in a dream. The cabin was warm. The fire in the hearth was burning cleanly and steadily, the flames drawing straight up the chimney the way flames are meant to draw. There was no smoke in the air. The door on the north wall, closed now behind them, did not so much as shudder in its frame. The single window beside it was calm. The entire building felt like the still center of a wheel. Thomas moved without hesitation. He had heard the number of footsteps. He knew there were 7 people in his cabin, counting the children. He knew one of them was being carried. "Set her by the fire," he said. "Not too close. On the rug." Larry laid Nancy down on the woven rug in front of the hearth. Ruth was already unlacing her own children's boots and rubbing their hands between her palms. Kenneth knelt beside his sister-in-law and began to work at the laces of her boots. His fingers were too stiff to manage the knots. Thomas knelt across from him. He found the laces by touch and worked them free with practiced ease. He drew the boots off gently, one and then the other, and set them aside. Then he peeled the wet stockings down and off. He ran his fingertips lightly along the soles of Nancy's feet and along the tops, and he did not speak while he did it. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels. "She'll keep her feet," he said. "Both of them, but we have to be careful now. Not the fire. Not yet. Warm water first, then wool. If you thaw her too fast, she'll lose skin and maybe more." He rose and moved to the stove without pausing to feel for anything. A kettle was already on the back of the stove. kept warm through the night as a matter of habit. He poured hot water into a wooden basin and carried it back to the hearth. Ruth added cool water from a bucket by the door until Thomas, testing the temperature with the inside of his wrist, nodded that it was right. They lowered Nancy's feet into the basin. She made a small sound, the first sound she had made since falling in the snow, and her eyes fluttered. "That's good," Thomas said quietly. "That's the pain coming back. Pain is life. Keep her feet in the water. I'll get blankets." He moved across the cabin to a chest beside the bed and returned with an armful of wool blankets. He wrapped Nancy's shoulders. He wrapped the children. He wrapped Ruth. Then finally he wrapped Larry, who had not yet spoken since crossing the threshold. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. By first light, the wind had dropped to a whisper, and the valley below the rise lay under a smooth white silence broken only by the occasional crack of a settling drift. Inside the cabin, 7 people slept in the warmth of a fire that had never once faltered through the night. Nancy lay wrapped in wool by the hearth, her feet dry and pink and whole. Shepard lay across her ankles as if he had appointed himself their guardian. Kenneth was the first to wake. He sat up slowly on the floor where he had slept and looked around the small room in the pale gray light coming through the window. Thomas was already up. He was at the stove, moving a pot of oats with a wooden spoon, and Kenneth watched him for a long moment before he spoke. "How did you know?" Thomas did not turn. "Know what?" "That the wind would come from the south, that we would need the mound where you put it." Thomas set the spoon down. He came and sat on the bench opposite Kenneth with his hands folded in his lap. He was quiet for a moment, and then he told Kenneth about Sela's boon and the leather-bound journal and the year of observations. He told him about the gap in the ridge line and the rotating pressure systems that came down out of the Rockies. He told him about the 4 evenings by lantern light in the lean-to, when Sela's had read the whole journal aloud from cover to cover, and Thomas had memorized every word of it. "I didn't guess where to put the door," Thomas said. "I didn't guess where to put the berm. I had a full year of data. Nobody else in Bramble Hollow had ever measured any of it. They all thought they knew the wind because they'd lived here. I couldn't afford to think I knew, so I hired a man to see it for me." Kenneth sat with that for a long time. Behind him, the others were beginning to stir. Ruth was sitting up. Nancy was blinking at the ceiling. "You never told anyone," Kenneth said finally. "Nobody asked. And if I'd told you, you would have said you already knew about the south winds. Every one of you would have. And then you would have gone home and built the same way you always build." Kenneth did not argue because it was true. By mid-morning, the sun was out. The families walked back down the rise together, following the trail Thomas broke ahead of them with Shepard at his side. Their own cabins, when they reached them, told the rest of the story. Larry's roof was gone. Kenneth's south wall was cracked from sill to eave. 3 other cabins in the settlement had lost roofs or windows or worse. One family had lost their entire chimney. Nobody had died. But nobody, from that day forward, spoke of Thomas Ainsworth as the blind man who built his cabin backwards. In the years that followed, when new settlers came to Bramble Hollow and asked which way to face their doors, the answer was no longer automatic. Kenneth Marrow would take them up the rise and show them Thomas's cabin and Thomas's berm, and he would tell them about a year of observations recorded in a leather-bound journal. He would tell them that the wind in the valley was not what any of them had thought it was, and he would tell them always that the man who had understood it best was the one who could not see it at all. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and hard-won wisdom from the American frontier. Leave a comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Thomas's place?